G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. And just how dangerous should an idea have to be in order for a government to be able to penalise a social media company for allowing it to be posted? That is the question that the Australian government is trying to wrestle with, and oh boy, it is causing a bit of a hoo-ha in Australian politics. This gets to fundamental questions of free speech and dissent, and how to wrestle with social media companies and this grand universe of algorithms that has been unleashed on us in recent years. The bill that has been passed by the Australian House of Representatives is called the Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill. Talk about an Orwellian title, the Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill. And it has a lot of civil libertarians worried. It has a lot of constitutional law experts worried. It seeks to, in the words of the bill, impose obligations on digital communications platform providers, that is, social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, in relation to the dissemination of content on a digital communications platform that contains information that is reasonably verifiable as false, misleading, or deceptive, and is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. So a lot of people are saying, well, how do you define and who decides what information is false, misleading, or deceptive, and what is or is not a serious harm? I was terrified, frankly, by this potential law and was afraid that shows like mine and people who have dissenting opinions about a whole range of different things, whether that is the vilification of minorities, because they have a different idea about, for example, biological sex, or whether that is some dissenting opinion about a public health concern, that those people could be subject to prosecution by the Australian government. That is sort of the rumour that's going around, and it is an unfounded one, which doesn't mean that this bill is not bad in many ways, and we're about to unpack how it is. But those ways are more subtle and nuanced than the civil libertarian / right-wing headlines that are screaming that the Australian government is trying to impose Orwellian speech codes on social media. I wanted to speak to someone who basically disagrees with me about the primacy of free speech and has a much more pragmatic, frankly, much more Aussie attitude towards speech online than I do, inflected as my opinion is with the precepts of both journalism and United States ideas about free speech. Daniel Angus is a professor of digital communications at Queensland University of Technology. He runs their Digital Media Research Centre. He's very active in researching and advising governments on information and disinformation. He's worked on projects like evaluating the challenge of fake news and other malinformation, as he calls it. Now, it's worth knowing that this bill has passed the House of Representatives, but it has stalled in the Senate, where the governing centre-left Labor Party, which has written this bill, and I believe has the support of the Greens, is struggling to find the additional votes that it needs to get it through the Senate. In the Australian Senate, there are independent senators. Yes, to the American ear, it sounds crazy that you would have anything other than a Democrat or a Republican, but we have a half dozen or so independents in the Senate. So the opposition party, which is the centre-right party, is against this, and it does not currently look, knock on wood, like the government is going to be able to persuade enough of the independents. I think they need 3 of the independents to get it through the Senate and to make this a law. Today, I'm speaking on Thursday, was an inquiry at the Senate in which senators were questioning experts about this particular bill. It is on a razor's edge. There are only 2 weeks left in the parliamentary term before the end of the year. The government very much wants to get this done. I'm sure it is cajoling and bribing those independent senators in every legal, of course, every legal way they possibly can to secure their votes. I hope that this conversation not only sheds some light on this particular bill, but on the bigger questions that we face regarding misinformation, disinformation, and transparency from social media companies. Please enjoy as much as I did, the one and only Daniel Angus. Good-o. What does this bill do and what does it not do, Daniel?
So the misinformation bill, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what it does is primarily it is about transparency. And I feel that this has kind of run away from the government in a little bit in some of the media speculation around it and other community concern, is that a lot of people see this as essentially like ACMA, the Australian Communication Media Authority, being able to directly censor or change, or take down content from social media platforms. It's nothing of the sort. What it is a set of powers that enable them to actually force greater transparency from platforms about how they are already moderating much of the online space. So,
but just to clarify, if the platforms are not doing adequate moderation, according to the Australian government, doesn't the bill make it incumbent on those companies to come up with a code that the Australian government regards as being adequate to deal with misinformation? Yes. In other words, it may not be quite as Pollyanna as you're suggesting, in the sense that although it doesn't give the Australian government the ability to clamp down on misinformation itself, it does give the Australian government the ability to outsource that clamping down to social media companies.
Yeah, to demand the platforms. Yeah, absolutely. So it does give ACMA some powers indeed to try to force the platforms to do more, perhaps in terms of the kind of what they're doing to curb the spread of misinformation and disinformation on the platforms. To do so, there is a fairly high threshold in terms of the manner in which they would go about doing that. And so those harms that they refer to are pretty specific in terms of the ways in which they would expect that to happen. And indeed, I think in practice, it would be a process that would involve a lot of back and forth between ACMA and the platforms in terms of opening up about the technical mechanisms that they can use, the ways in which they are trying to comply with this. I don't see this as something that individuals should be concerned about, that ACMA or the platforms are going to be coming for them, right? Unless they are indeed those who are already spreading huge amounts of hate speech in, largely factually inaccurate information, which is, cause for harm.
I mean, maybe, but the bill doesn't specify that you have to be producing vast quantities of misinformation or disinformation.
It needs to be a reasonable threshold, right? So the point here is that threshold, right? And that's the question. So that language doesn't really suggest that a single post is going to meet a reasonable threshold. I'm perfectly willing to believe that in reality, in practice, it would pan out that way. But one of the things about fundamental human rights is you don't want to outsource them to governments on the assurance that it's probably going to be fine. And if it reminds me a little bit of people in authoritarian regimes saying, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. You shouldn't worry about your own private. The government, is on your side. Well, okay, but let's just make sure that it's actually codified that way as well, because some of those, so that people understand what we're talking about when we talk about the kinds of harms, right? Should we just look at what they actually are? So we're talking about content. This is the wording of the bill: content that contains information that is reasonably verifiable as false, misleading, or deceptive, and that content is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. And the meaning of serious harm is harm to the operation or integrity of a Commonwealth, state, territory, or local government electoral or referendum process, or harm to public health, including to the efficacy of preventative health measures, or vilification of a group in Australian society distinguished by race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, disability, nationality, or national or ethnic origin, or vilification of an individual because of a belief that the individual is a member of such a group. Imminent harm to the Australian economy is another, including harm to public confidence in the banking system or financial markets. You can imagine things that a dissident economist could say about an impending banking collapse or housing collapse that could cause imminent harm to the Australian economy, such as harm to public confidence in financial markets. You can imagine a dispute between a transgender activist and a radical feminist over whether or not biological males should be able to compete in girls' sports that would seem to be vilification of a group in Australian society. You could imagine an argument about, whether or not a pathogen is airborne, whether or not masks are efficacious at a particular point in a pandemic that could constitute a harm to public health in Australia. And the burden of proof is still on
government to prove that though, right? And so that's it. I think there is wiggle room in this to kind of that it needs to be established, right? Beyond reasonable doubt that has the potential and it's reasonable, right?
But what is the court, like what is the judicial oversight by which the reasonable doubt threshold is met?
All right, let's back away from this for a second because I don't think this is going in a productive direction. Because remember, we're not talking about ACMA policing individual pieces of content, right? So
no, but I mean, it's small consolation that they're requiring someone in Silicon Valley to do it for them. How is someone in Silicon Valley going to understand enough about Australian democracy and markets?
They're already doing it though, right? And this is, I think, something that's really missing from this is that platforms moderate content. And they have done for years, right? But they do so in a way where we have no transparency or no insight into how they do that. I mean, this is why the Facebook Oversight Board was established, right? To be able to look into those situations away from the platform to make sense of what had transpired and whether the platform was right to say take down content or not take it down, and apply, principles to those decisions. Now that exists for Meta, right? But that doesn't exist for any of the other platforms. And so what I feel here is an attempt to try and take some of those principles and apply them at a national level to kind of force that transparency around, well, how are you moderating and tell us how you're going about doing this as a first step. Now, as part of that, they've tried to define the kind of content that they are most concerned with, right? Which is mis and disinformation. And that's become the focus of debate and indeed the heart of the bill. I do have some reservations in how this whole thing has come to pass, right? I don't agree with the way in which they have defined mis and disinformation. I think it's immaterial to try to define a difference between them. In our submission, we said as much, right? We made a submission to this from the centre that I lead. And we said, look, intent actually doesn't change the fact of whether this does harm or not, right?
Because intent is the salient difference for the government between misinformation and disinformation, right? And you're saying that doesn't matter. If it's bullshit, it's bullshit.
If we're talking about, so let's use examples, say, like vaccine misinformation or something like that. If we have a feeling that that's doing harm to Australian society and public health, then it makes little difference about whether the person is willingly doing that or somehow just inadvertently doing that. It's still going to do harm. And so the point is the platform should do something about not allowing that to spread or spread widely within its platform environment. And so that needs to be at the core of this, right? A discussion around, okay, there is problematic information that is spreading on these platforms. We study it day in, day out here. We see it. What we don't see are transparency around what platforms are doing about that, how they are deciding what content to leave up, the mechanisms through which they're doing that. And they're essentially operating under a voluntary code right now, which clearly is not working, right? Misinformation is still rife in our communities through these platforms. And so the government is really just stepping in and saying, look, you tried to do it voluntarily. It's really not working out. We're going to force your hand a little bit through a legislative process now.
That sounds understandable, but it makes me wonder why not do it in two stages? Because there is stuff that I like in this bill. I think the transparency component is critical. I mean, I've called for a long time for extremely aggressive attempts to understand what's going on under the hood of social media companies, because I think it's completely untenable that our information ecosystem is being dictated by algorithms whose provenance we don't understand, what they're doing we don't understand, the exact ways in which they're prioritizing certain information over other information we don't understand. It's completely inscrutable and it's driving us all insane. So I do like the section of the bill, and I'll just read it for the listener. The digital platform rules are made for purposes of the subclause that may require digital communications platform providers to give approved independent researchers access to data in relation to the extent to which misinformation or disinformation may be amplified on digital communications platforms provided by the providers. So yes, let's see. I mean, I'm not crazy about the government being able to compel a social media platform to hand over misinformation and disinformation that it has regulated. I mean, are you okay with this not? Just from a civil libertarian point of view? So there's a clause that says that if the government has reasonable grounds to believe that the provider, that is the social media platform, has information or a document that is relevant to misinformation or disinformation on the platform, then it may, meaning the government, require the provider to give it any such information or produce any such documents.
Now, there's some caveats here that are important to note too.
Okay.
So there is restrictions on what can be handed over. So they can't hand over private information.
That's right. They can't provide DMs, but they can provide any.
Yeah, and they can't provide
post.
details on a user, for example. So they couldn't give us, say, the user's email address or something like that. That is private information. But what they could provide is, for example, if there is a post that pertains to mis and disinformation, or a series of posts that have been made in a generally public way, they could provide that, or the government could compel the platform to provide that access to that kind of data so that independent researchers can make determinations as to, in an independent way, as to the extent of which, say, misinformation is still a problem on this platform. So what this speaks to, I mean, this is an amendment that was pushed by Zoe Daniels, and it's an amendment that much of the
research. And who's Zoe Daniels?
So Zoe Daniels is a member of parliament that sits on the crossbench, right? So is someone is a independent politician in the Australian federal parliament currently, and so Zoe Daniels has put this amendment through because many of us actually have done a bit of lobbying, to be honest, behind the scenes, because the research community has been calling for legislated access to platform data for a very long time. And why we need that is that most of what we know in terms of the good and bad of social media has come from independent research, right? Academic researchers like me and others. So the fact that we talk about misinformation in the way that we do is because of academic researchers having researched misinformation for as long as we have. The fact we talk about all the other things is largely because you have a fair number of communications and other digital media researchers out there doing this work. Now, historically, we've been able to get skerricks of platform data directly from the platforms or in other ways that we've kind of been able to collect it. So when you log online on your own platforms, you have your own experience, but much of that experience is not able to be seen by anyone else these days. Like, so if you're on Facebook, unless you've got access to what Facebook call their meta content library, no one has access to that data except approved researchers, and only some of that data is accessed through that. If you're on X still, they used to have a research data access provision. Now you've got to pay a huge sum to get access to that API to get that data out. So for us to do fundamental research on, and you said yourself, like, these platforms are baked into our society. Like, these are fundamental communication platforms in our society. We need to be able to research them, to know what's being said on them and what's kind of happening there. And so this clause is critical, right? You could almost, I think, if, regardless of whether you like the misinformation stuff, you could write a whole bill just on this bit, right?
That's what I would like. I would love that. Like, yes.
And we've been asking for that. We've been asking for that bill for decades, right? But look, that's part of it. And you have to understand, like, for me at the moment, this is almost at a fundamental level that by itself is enough to say, okay, I agree with some other points. I would love to see the broader news media brought under the auspice of this bill as well, because much of our research points to the fact that actually, while social media bears the brunt of complaint, and amongst the media, usually traditional media, when it comes to misinformation, it's the traditional media that's probably doing the worst sometimes when it comes to misinformation and false narratives. I mean, I did an interview this week on 3AW, and my gosh, right? Just waiting to go on air, I counted about 20 instances of absolute blatant misinformation while I was waiting to come on and talk.
About this topic?
About this topic, right?
Who was hosting?
I don't want to mention his name.
Okay.
I don't want to give this guy more oxygen. But
okay.
Look,
trust me, this is for listeners who are not in Australia, we're talking about the largest and most listened to radio station in the second largest metropolis. So I don't think my podcast is necessarily going to platform this gentleman. But if you think about very popular conservative populist talkback radio, then that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Yeah. So you must find it very frustrating then, Daniel. I mean, what are the big misconceptions here? I guess the misconception is that the government's going to go after individuals for posting something online.
Yeah, and that's the way that he was presenting it to his audience, is that you all need to be really fearful of government now because they're coming after you. The government censors are going to be after you, and that somehow like ACMA is going to be compel the platforms to take down individual pieces of information. That is not the nature.
To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen, and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.